right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Miranda Purcell. I'm the Viticulture Extension Specialist at Purdue University. Welcome to Strawberry Chat. This is a discussion where we talk about up-and-coming issues on local small strawberry farms. And I want to remind everybody that this is being recorded and we will turn the recording into a podcast. So if you're on the email list, you'll get a link to be able to listen to the podcast after the fact. And with that, I will turn it over to my co-host, Dr. Wenjing Guan.
Hi, I'm Wenjing. I apologize we didn't have live discussions for a while in the summer. As the growing season slows down, we will continue this journey with farm and educational discussions with expert and strawberry farmers. Today, our guest is Dr. Dan Egel. Dan is an extension plant pathologist at Purdue. I know most vegetable growers in Indiana are very familiar with Dan, but maybe not for folks from other states. So Dan, could you talk a little bit about yourself and what do you do?
Okay, thank you, Wenjing. So for 28 years, I've worked with vegetable growers across the state here in Indiana. My role is as a vegetable disease specialist. So when growers have vegetable disease problems or think they do, I'm the one who works with them. I do extension and applied research. But as you know, Wenjing, since you're working down the hall from me and you've gotten involved in strawberries, I've gotten involved in a little bit of strawberry research. I work with you. Of course, keep in contact with Janet Beckerman on campus, who is the strawberry disease specialist. But I think what we'll talk about today are issues that affect vegetables and strawberries as well.
Our topic today is about preventing diseases in growing strawberry plaques. As Dan said, this applies to both strawberry growers and vegetable growers. So some background of why we want to discuss this topic at the Strawberry Chat. Recently, there has been a growing interest in plasticulture strawberry. It is possible to plant bare roots on plastic, but many find it is more convenient to use plaque plants. Strawberry plaque plants are like vegetable transplants, have actively growing roots. Typically, they were planted in 15-cell trees. And plaques are produced from rounder tips. Basically, the process is to put the rounder tips in a moistened growing medium and water regularly in the first few days to prevent the leaves from dying out and encourage root growth. And to grow plaque plants, it's a fast process, typically taking 3-4 weeks from rounder tips to plaque plants. Strawberry growers, fruit growers, some are purchased plaque plants from nurseries, but I know also some small farmers also purchase rounder tips and grow their own plaque plants. This past summer, we know at least 2 cases that strawberry growers who were growing their own plaque plants had disease problems that resulted in plant loss. The fungi Pisium and the rhizoctonias were found in those diseased plants. I would like to start this discussion with Dan about these 2 pathogens, rhizoctonia and Pisium. Dan, could you tell us where those pathogens come from and at what conditions do they cause the problem?
So there's many pathogens that can affect roots of vegetables or strawberry plants. The 2 primary ones that we'll talk about today are rhizoctonia and Pythium. But I want people to keep in mind that there's several others. Rhizoctonia and Pythium are ubiquitous. They're everywhere in the soil. So almost any soil that you choose, there's going to be some of each of these pathogens, each of these organisms in the soil. So for example, if you are growing plug trays and you set this directly on the ground, whether it be in a greenhouse or outside, and those roots contact the ground, or the soilless mix contacts the ground, that they could come up through that uh, into the trays. Or if there was splash, if you had them outside in a splash, either through your own irrigation or rain, and it could splash into those soils, then it could splash from that ground and you'd have rhizoctonia and or pythium in your plugs then. So where does it come from? It comes from the soil. Both these organisms live very well in the soil in the absence of any host, whether they have a plant to live on or not. They can live in the soil. This is in contrast with some of the other pathogens we'll talk a little bit about today, like common leaf spot or this neopest disease, or some of the other anthracnose. Those will survive on crop residue, but they do not live long term in the soil.
Now we know they are ambiguous everywhere in the soil. If they get contact to the plants, the trees, the soil is medium, and what conditions they will cause problem.
So a lot of times I see these pathogens early in the season when it's a little bit cool, and they like wet. So in vegetable conditions, if for example plants are overwatered in a greenhouse, or if you have trays outside and there's been a big rain, those rains and that wet condition will favor the either of those pathogens. But if you want to look at it more simply, any condition which under where the plant is stressed and slows down, that allows kind of if you think about it, the fungus to catch up. And so if you have transplant trays that you used, for example, last season, and you didn't clean those and sanitize those, that can be a source of the pathogen. For example, if you had the disease last year, or even in a previous generation, and you use those trays again, that can be a source of the pathogen. So are dirty tools. If you take soilless mix, which should come from your supplier pretty clean, and you dump it on the soil, or you dump it on a wagon or someplace that's been dirty from last season, or if you use tools that haven't been cleaned, that's also a possible source of these fungi. So if you dump the soil on the ground and then shovel it into the trays, you may be contaminating the soil without realizing it. So and a lot of times people will say, well, these diseases are occurring, and it's been wet, it's been cool, we have conditions, but unless you have those pathogens are in the soil, you can't have the disease. You have to have those pathogens. So to me, that's why sanitation is so critical here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thanks, Dan. Things I learned here, it's first for those diseases to happen, the pathogen has to be around, and the pathogen is everywhere in the soil. So anything you use to grow the plaque plants, like trays, tools, if there's a little bit of soil not cleaned up very well, attached on the trays, tools, you could bring them to the system, and so the pathogens here.
Yes. Another thing is if you can raise those trays above the ground, on a bench, or even on pallets or something, or if you have to put them on the ground, if you had some kind of landscape cloth down, that would also help to keep those pathogens from splashing or otherwise getting into those trays.
Yeah, I guess actually that comes to a thing I was asked about grower. If you do have landscape, or I know some folks I see in their farms, they have the gravels around the areas. You definitely want it in a larger area than where the trees are, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So prevent the soil out of those either fabrics to splash, not directly splash to the trees. Yeah.
And you have to you have to think about when rain comes down or irrigation comes down, how far is it going to splash? Yes.
Right.
And then of course, if you're walking past those trays and if your feet are dirty, then you're tracking it that way as well. So
I see. Interesting. And now we understand those pathogens is in the soil and vigorously, and we don't want to burn them in the system. And it will cause problem if they are in the system. But on the other side, you mentioned the plant is stressed, like overwatering. So is that my understanding is when you keep them too wet, overwatering, the plant is stressed up and it will make the disease more likely to happen. Is that right?
yes.
Wet conditions in plaque production, it's easy to get overwater. It's also depends on the type of mediums growers choose. I can see there's a dilemma here. We do want to have a medium can hold enough moisture because at the beginning we encourage the plants to grow roots. If it's dried up, it will kill the plants. The leaves die, they won't grow enough roots. So we do want to a medium hold water. But if the mediums do not have a good drainage, it will cause problem on the disease side.
Right.
So choosing the right media is very critical.
Yeah. So typically Wenjing, and we've spoken about this, but there are some media that don't have enough perlite or vermiculite, for example, and they might be less expensive, but those media are hard to wet up, and then when they do wet up, they stay wet. So you want to try to maybe pay a little bit more for a media that is easily drained and easy to wet up.
Yeah, we definitely see this happens on growing vegetable transplants. Okay, next question that I want to discuss with you is now, of course, farmers don't want to this problem happens, but if it does happen, it will be bad. They kill the plants, and those plants cannot be, it's killed, it's dead. But typically in reality, there are some areas the plants get killed, and in adjacent areas, probably the problem is not so bad. There are some minor symptoms, but the plant still alive. Now the farmers is struggling. Are they still okay to use those plants? Otherwise, they don't have access to plant it. I totally understand the struggles here. So then I know you were asked these questions a lot. So can you explain to us what should be considered in making this decision?
Well, first, I think you need to think about if you're selling these plants, if you're taking the plants and selling them to, I think you need to be very, very careful about selling symptomatic plants to someone else, and unless perhaps you describe the problem to them. So that's, I guess I would think if I was selling those plugs, I wouldn't want to sell symptomatic plants at all. If you're using those plants for yourself, that's of course a decision that you can make. And then I think you need to remember if you are first I just have, as a plant pathologist, I feel like I have to say, if you're planting symptomatic plants, you have to realize that those symptomatic plants may die or have problems later on. And I think you'd mentioned black root rot would be something that they might have later on. But if you see, as you're going through a tray or trays and looking for symptomatic plants, if you look at those and they have symptoms on the crown, let's see here. So if you look at, this is in the ground, this is not a plug situation, but if you look at these plants, and I've got a red arrow on one which is smaller, this should be a clue to you that there might be something wrong with this one. And in a plug tray, you can imagine a similar situation where one is just smaller, and you may have to dig some of those up and look at the roots and decide, is it smaller because of disease? And I think I have a photo, and I wanted to emphasize here that this is Rhizoctonia. I was able to confirm this on these And this does not easily spread from plant to plant, and it does survive in the soil for long, long periods. So if you dig this up and you look at the crown part here, the lower part of the stem, and it is discolored like this, I think there's a high possibility that this plant will not survive long term if in a plug situation. And if you look at the roots, what you're looking at is for those roots which are discolored dark. And of course, the higher proportion of roots that are discolored, the less likely it is to survive. So this one, I would say probably 50 to 60% of the roots are discolored, and that plant's probably not going to survive. But if you're using it yourself and you see just a little bit of discoloration, then maybe you could decide, hey, maybe this one will survive, and I want to take that risk. I have here 2 plugs. The one on the left here has Pythium root rot, and you can see some of it's not discolored so much, but the roots are very thin. And again, I was able to confirm Pythium. And whereas the one on the right is what you want to see. You want a plug that looks nice and healthy and fills the tray like that. And just again, if you look at this Pythium, and you look at some of the roots are nice and large, and some of them are very thin, and that's a sign of Pythium.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So if you are making those decisions yourself, stay away from those crowns that are discolored. You may have to dig up a few to look at the roots. You may not be able to tell from looking at the above ground symptoms on the tray, and realize that when you look at the tray, that as you look at a tray, it's the symptoms in the roots are probably going to be worse than the above ground symptoms. And sometimes you may find root symptoms on plants that look okay on above ground. So you may have to sacrifice a few plants to look at those to tell whether there's any root problems or not.
It makes sense to me then. Like right now we are talking about Pythium and Rhizoctonia. Those are the survives in the soil, so they would affect the root first before we see any symptoms on above ground. That makes sense to me. So you say even growers making that decision, don't just look at the leaves, see if they're looking bad. If they're still okay, they will plant. But more looking at the roots, because sometimes the roots that have problems, they may haven't show up above ground.
Right.
So put some of the plants out, check the root to see if the roots is healthy. If the roots still healthy, that plants have a higher chance to survive.
Yes.
Yeah. And you mentioned briefly earlier black root rot. I know many strawberry growers are familiar with black root rot. Are those the same passages that cause black root rot as the ones we discussed here, Rhizoctonia and Pythium?
So if you look at, and you shared a bulletin about black root rot with me, and if you look at that, it mentions Rhizoctonia, Pythium, as well as some other ones. So if you planted something that had Rhizoctonia in there, and you planted that out in the field, and there was Pythium there, and I think it had mentioned a Fusarium and even a nematode. So it would possibly predispose, if you planted something that had one of these diseases, it would predispose that plant to also have these other pathogens come in and eventually get black root rot. So yeah, so the Rhizoctonia and Pythium that we've talked about are a subset of the pathogens mentioned in black root rot.
Okay, so it could be if you plant some of the plaque plants have those pathogens that survived in soil, and although it survived initially, but caused some problems later on.
Yes.
But black root rot is not necessarily coming from plaque plants, because those pathogens are everywhere in the soil. And yes. So it's not necessarily means coming from the plaque plants, but the stressed plants at the beginning is more likely to get those problems later on.
Right. And I should mention that, of course, all this is dependent on conditions of the soil type, whether it's a raised bed, how much precipitation you get. There's all kind of other factors involved as well.
Yeah, makes sense. We go back to plaque production. Actually, you already mentioned some of those diseases, those diseases like Anthracnose, Phytophthora. Those can also cause plants collapse if the runner tips where the original material to grow in plaque plants have those pathogens, right? It also causes the plants have problem. The plaques have problems. So then, can you tell us the difference between those pathogens compared to Piscium and Rhizoctonia?
The ones that you mentioned, Anthracnose, that are neopest pathogen, common leaf spot, some of those common diseases that we see every year, those can come in on tips. They can come in on tips. They can also spread from nearby field. And once they're in there, they can spread quickly, depending on the weather or the overhead irrigation, can spread quickly from plant to plant in any season. Phytophthora is a little bit different because although Phytophthora can spread quickly across the field, Phytophthora will also survive very well in the soil, unfortunately. Whereas the others we mentioned, Anthracnose, Neopest, common leaf spot, those will survive on crop residue, but you should be able to rotate away from that. So once, after a couple of seasons, after the strawberry plants have been completely disintegrated, those probably, the Anthracnose, Neopest, common leaf spot, those will disappear, whereas Phytophthora can survive in the soil very well. But all of those can spread from plant to plant given the right conditions of rain and wind. In contrast, then, Rhizoctonia and Pythium, those survive in this, not only in the crop residue, but they survive in the soil. So even if you are out of strawberry production for 10 years, those pathogens, those fungi could still be in there. And you could plant watermelon, you could plant strawberry, you could plant wheat, you could leave it fallow, and those Rhizoctonia and Pythium and Phytophthora would still be there. But Rhizoctonia and Pythium are not going to spread from plant to plant. Now, within a season, and the irrigation water can spread it downhill, for example, it might spread to other plants or other parts of the field, but they aren't going to splash and spread from plant to plant. Now, you may, if you go out in the field and you find Pythium on plants, you may later find more plants with Pythium down that same row. But what that probably means is there was already Pythium on those plants late down the row. You just couldn't see it yet. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay. So the ways these plants spread, it's those disease spread is different. And also, I think in the plaque production period, where those pathogens come from is also different. Like you said, Rhizoctonia piscium, it's coming from the soil. So right. You have that contaminated in your system. But the other pathogens could, because they survive on plant materials, could come from the tips. That actually come to the point. It's so critical to get the tips from reputable suppliers. We know nothing is guaranteed, but have a reliable source to get the clean planting materials is extremely critical.
Yes. So, and I wanted to mention, I don't know if we're going to mention this here or later, Wenjing, but if you, for example, are ordering tips of several different varieties and growing those yourself, my recommendation would be that if you had, for example, flats of tip 1, variety 2, and variety 3, that you separate those physically. And for example, if you're growing those in a greenhouse, have the trays for tip 1 over here, and then leave probably at least 3 or 4 feet between that and variety 2. And the reason is because if a disease comes in on variety 1 and it's right next to variety 2, it can spread right across those because you're overhead irrigating those, right? And I see the same thing with, for example, tomato growers. They'll have several different varieties and they'll put them right next to each other. And if you get the disease in one, it can spread quickly. So separate those physically.
I think you also talked to me before on vegetables. If you have the source coming from different suppliers, you should also separate that, right?
Yes, yeah. So I would, if you had, for example, if you could only get so many plugs from this supplier, and then you had to order so many plugs of the same variety from a different supplier, I would separate those as well. If you go back to the analogy with vegetable production, if you had tomatoes and you had variety X, and even if you had different lot numbers and that's of course vegetables and seeds, I would separate the lot numbers as well. You just in case it comes in on one, it's not going to separate and go to the other. And I have an example with cabbage that I came across last year that was just striking. And the disease came in on one variety and spread to another. So I know it may seem like it's difficult to separate those, but I highly recommend, if you absolutely cannot separate those in space, then put some kind of a board or something so it doesn't splash from one to the other. And yes, different suppliers, the same thing.
Another thing I really learned here, disease like Anthracnose. If the plaque plants have those pathogens on it, it probably not a good idea to plant them at all because the spread plants by plants. So you take a much higher risk than planting something have a little bit of pcm on it. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, I think that's correct. That's correct.
Okay.
And I go through the same thing with vegetable growers, and and it's critical planting time, and they want those varieties. And of course that's a decision everybody has to make. And it depends on the disease. Basically, I was agreeing with you. Avoid planting cultivars that you know are diseased, and there's probably a greater risk with the something like common leaf spot or neopest than with even the Pythium or the Rhizok. Yes.
Yes, so that because of the ways they spread is different.
Right.
Okay, now then come to this question. It's okay. Is that possible to separate those diseases based on just the symptoms?
I can, of course, I do this for a living, I guess, so I can go in and look at those and have some idea whether it's, like you say, neopest or rhizoctonia. But a lot of times, even I'll have to go into the lab and do that. So my recommendation is to send those off to a diagnostic laboratory where they do that for a living. And I don't think you have to send every new symptom to the diagnostic laboratory, but as you're going from season to season and you see something new, I think it makes sense to send those samples off and get an official diagnosis.
But then if you see a plants collapsed, like the picture I showed you earlier, plaque trace, it's with diagnostic of rhizoctonia. I was just thinking if I saw those last year, is this year I could assume it's rhizoctonia again?
It's difficult. I think it's easier when I have when you bring me one of those like anthracnose or neopest or common leaf spot, those are easier for me to diagnose. But when you get to some with the soil-borne ones, I think those are very difficult. And I think if you had the disease last year, the rhizoctonia, for example, you can assume that you'll probably have it, next year. But it's very difficult to tell.
I was thinking as we discussed where the pathogens come from. If a grower faced that problem this year with rhizoctonia, I think it probably better for him to change get rid of the trays, all those, and to use new things to start to get off the pathogens, right?
Yeah, that's the safer bet. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Now we talk about the important to ID those diseases, and Dan have already mentioned several suggestions of prevent the disease in plaque production. Is there anything else, Dan, you think you want to add?
Well, so when you purchase soilless mix, of course, you want to purchase mix with bags that aren't damaged, right? You want to store those bags in a place where they're not going to get wet or damaged. You want to store those bags, on pallets or, for example, something above ground. You don't want to use bags that have been damaged. And then you want to open those bags on a at least clean surface, if not sanitized. You want to use clean, if not sanitized tools. You want to put them in new or clean and sanitized trays. You want to keep those trays off the ground if possible. You want to keep them on a fairly level surface. If you have them on, for example, the ground, and you have low spots, and those low spots might collect water, for example, and that's oftentimes where I see the first problems. I like to tell people when I go to a restaurant, I expect it to be clean. I can't necessarily see the kitchen, but I hope the kitchen is clean and well organized. And if it's not clean, I start to worry about my own health. And when I go into an operation where it's a greenhouse or that kind of thing, an agricultural operation, I like to see that things are well marked, they're organized, they're clean. The shovels are stored clean with the ends up, and the trays are stacked neatly off the ground, clean. So I would think of your operation like a restaurant, I guess is my advice.
So keep everything clean, organized, sanitized, and some other tricks you mentioned, separate cultivars, choose an area of growing plaques is away from strawberry production, right? In case something spread.
And if you're working in the strawberry production and go right to the plugs, then you want to clean off or be careful with that. I don't know if this is the time we want to mention this, Wenjing, but for sanitize, if you're doing clean is 95% of it, 95% of shovels, trays, clean. If you clean them, that's most of it. But I recommend a sanitizer, something like a 10% bleach, quaternary ammonium compound. There's different peroxide products, chlorine dioxide. I don't really care which you use. Follow the label for bleach. Of course, it doesn't have that kind of label, but be very careful with that, because I've known people who will do that and wash trays and sanitize it without gloves. And of course, that can be hard on your eyes. So wear goggles, wear gloves. Know that at least with bleach, if you have a solution and it's old, right? Eventually, it's sunlight. The two things that deactivate bleach are sunlight and organic matter, right? And I could tell you stories about when I worked at a pool, but so if you use bleach solution, no, you have to change it periodically when it gets too dirty, and if you're doing it outside, that will deactivate the solution as well.
Be aware the effectiveness when
Right.
you're using bleach. It's not taking it granted. If you use bleach, you clean everything. The next question that I want to ask, I know you work on synthetic fungicide, organic fungicide, all those things, and I want to ask your opinion of spraying fungicide on plague plants. Maybe you can talk both synthetic and organic fungicide. I know for small farmers, they probably don't have many options for synthetic fungicide, but they may want to use some organic fungicide to prevent. What's your opinions on those?
So that you shared with me a bulletin from Frank Lowe's from North Carolina State, and when he talked about fungicides, he says that's a gray area for this, and I totally agree. I think especially if you're growing tips and you've used excellent sanitation, you've been very careful about your source, you've separated the varieties, I think you very well might get away with producing those tips in plug trays without fungicides. But there might be some instances where you might want to use fungicides, especially if you have noticed a particular disease in the past. If you're using synthetic, and I don't want to, I don't know strawberry fungicides as well as I do vegetable fungicides, but if you do grow stuff in the greenhouse, realize that first of all, I would use probably a fungicide which is broad spectrum. Okay, if it and then be careful if you're using it in a greenhouse. Some products specify do not use this in a greenhouse. So read the label very carefully. And as far as organic stuff, I've done some work and some research. In fact, I have we just wrote for tomato plants. We just wrote this bulletin, and it talks about different modes of action. And I'd be glad to talk with somebody about that, the different modes of action. For example, people use peroxide products a lot, like oxidate, and that's fine, but you need to realize that those don't have any residue. So as soon as you spray it, you can kill what's on the surface, but the moment it dries, it's not doing anything. Whereas a copper product probably would, and both of those are at least possibly certified organic, listed organic. Another issue is if you're producing those outside, I think you're much more likely to need fungicide because you're getting rain over top of those. But even the ones inside are being overhead irrigated. If you're putting them in a greenhouse and you're overhead irrigating, of course, one of the things I think Frank Lowe's talks about is making sure there's adequate ventilation in there, and of course making sure you're keeping the temperature right. You've raised those up, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know that I can talk about organic products in particular now, but if you want to, if somebody wants to contact me, we can go through the different products. I can send them, and I know this is about tomatoes, but there's a lot of stuff that talks about how different products work, which would be useful to somebody considering using organically listed products.
Yes, yes. I think your resources will be very valuable for strawberry growers as well as vegetable growers like PC and rhizoctonia. Those problems that no matter it's a fruit or vegetable transplants, right?
Right, and I should mention that when I'm talking about spraying, I'm talking about spraying for the ones we talked about, anthracnose and neopest and common leaf spot. There's really not much you can do about the pythium or the rhizoc. There's just really not much spraying you can do about that. That's to me, that's all prevention. It's all sanitation and in inspecting.
Yes, got it. Actually, I come another question. Then I know we haven't talked about this. I know it sometimes happens to the strawberry growers. They grow in plaques. They probably do not, like in the middle of the summer. They don't. Their greenhouse is too hot. They won't be able to grow them in greenhouse, so they choose to grow them outside. You also mentioned that, and I know it works fine because that's just a short period, 3-4 weeks. If they don't have heavy rains, everything is going great. They are expecting having a rain. So should they, and you mentioned they may use a broad spectrum fungicide. Should they spray it before the rain happens or after the rain happens? Do you have an idea?
So I have a whole talk that as you know, I have a whole talk that I give about using fungicides with rain. And the short answer is that for the most part, what you want to put a fungicide on before it rains and not after, because but when the disease is spread with rain, they need leaf wetness for infection for most diseases, and they need splashing from a rain to spread. So you want that fungicide on before it spreads, and not after. I could go on for an hour probably, but the other thing you need to look at is the label. Sometimes there's something on the label about fungicides and whatnot, but most of them there's not anything on there. But for the answer is, for in most circumstances you want that fungicide on before it rains and not after. If you have had a strong rain and you're afraid that it's washed it all off, what I would suggest doing is shortening that interval. Don't apply a fungicide, get a big rain, and apply another fungicide right afterwards. But what I would recommend is, if you're doing something on a 7 to 10 day interval and you get a big rain, and right after you applied something, don't apply it right away, but shorten the interval between your instead of going every 10 days, go every 7 days or 6 days or whatnot.
Yes, that makes sense. Okay, and then my last question related to fungicide is we know for growers we spray fungicide frequently in the field. The labels say like certain ounce per acre, and when we come to deal with the plague plants, how we convert those rates.
Frank Lowe's has some suggestions in his that bulletin that you shared with me. But what I do is it's just real simple. So if I have a square footage of for example, if you were growing plugs in a greenhouse, and you know the square footage, then, and if you want to call me or contact me, I'll help you through this. But whatever that is, whatever that square footage is, you can figure that as a percentage of an acre. And then once you know the percentage of an acre, then you know how much product to use. What I like to do then is convert it to metric, because usually metric's easier for small amounts. And I know that for growers that may not be an option. But if you want to call me, I'll be glad to walk you through that. And as we've talked about, and I have another talk that I give, a whole talk about applications of fungicides on small acreages, small areas. And I like to use a backpack sprayer. I have something on YouTube about this, but I prefer a backpack sprayer for several reasons than what I call a garden sprayer, the kind of the one you'd go to the hardware store and get. And I think it's more accurate. You can regulate the pressure. The nozzles are designed for pesticides. And it's you can calibrate it fairly easy. Whereas the garden sprayer, the most nozzles are not designed for pesticides, and you can bump it. And since the pressure goes down from the moment you start spraying, the amount of pesticide you're putting on with the garden sprayer is going to vary. So I would stay away from that.
That will be the end of our discussion today. Dan, we really, really appreciate you share all your knowledge here. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Miranda. And thanks everyone come to participate live. I'll see you next time.